Kongregate is a company that's kind of been doing their own thing since 2008?
We launched 2006.
2006. So when everybody else was paying attention to PC download games and the casual game space, Kongregate was launching some fantastic web games for a very different audience. And I think of all the companies right now, even though Midcore has sort of in the last year or so really become a hot topic, Kongregate kind of invented it, or at least had been leveraging and providing content into that audience for a long time. So we asked Emily to come here today, Emily GREER, who's one of the co-founders of Kongregate, to talk about what they've learned in leveraging free-to-play games into that audience over the last few years. And I'm really interested to hear what you have to say. So take it away.
Okay. Hello, very happy to be here. Today I'm going to talk about the 4 years that we've had a virtual goods business and sort of what led us to start it and the many stupid assumptions that we made going into it and then what we learned. So it's going to be kind of a walking through the process and then taking a look at a lot of the stats from the games that we have. So it's going to start with a little bit of Kongregate history and then move on to charts, lots of charts. So brief history, we started in 2006 and launched openly in 2007 as a developer-friendly open platform for free web games. To start with, all of our revenue was advertising. Almost all of the games were single player and Flash, so Desktop Tower Defense was our first big hit. We had a level and achievement system, which was an innovation, and it attracted a really core male audience, much more so than other web game destinations. So that was good, but we really didn't want to limit ourselves to just an advertising model. We, ourselves or our developers, we really thought that there was other opportunities to increase revenue, and we'd been hearing about microtransactions from Asia and how they were just this absolutely huge business. Not very many games had tried them in the US, but there was some success, particularly with virtual worlds like Second Life and Gaia. There was, of course, a very vibrant virtual goods game scene over here in Europe with Big Point and Inno and a lot of other games, but we were a little bit in a Silicon Valley bubble and weren't paying enough attention to that. And if we had, we probably would have made fewer mistakes. So when we heard microtransactions, we thought they would be small. We thought they were going to be less than $1. And from that, we had made a bunch of other assumptions that payment processing costs would be a big deal. On the average credit card transaction, there's a 25, 30 cent charge, which on a 50 cent payment is, almost everything. Therefore, we thought that incenting larger purchases would be really valuable, and that stored credit cards and existing balances would be a powerful way to reduce the friction of the transactions. Looking at virtual worlds, we thought that players would be buying cosmetic items and gifts, and because it was games, also some power-ups and content. And also, again, looking at the virtual worlds, we thought multiplayer and social elements would be crucial. And from the advertising, we'd learned that U.S. and the English-speaking market was much more valuable than any other part of the world. Working from that, we thought, let's build a platform for developers to use. Site-wide currency will really reduce the friction in the transactions. But there's not a point of a currency if there's no games to use it, and all of our single-player Flash devs really weren't thinking about microtransactions. So we decided to fund 6 games, focusing on synchronous multiplayer and unique gameplay. And this was kind of a redistribution of VC money to indie devs in 2007 and 2008. We worked with some really great teams that have gone on to make very successful games, including the recent hit Hundreds, Solid Skier, Bubble Safari, all came out of the teams that we worked with. But at the time, they were really over their heads working on synchronous multiplayer, and we were giving them terrible advice on the monetization. They were mostly tacked on, and we really shied away from pay-to-win elements and ended up with things, cosmetic items, some VIP subscriptions that included content, and some power-ups in currency, but that wasn't the focus. So our currency, Creds, launched in November 2008, and the premium games that we'd funded launched gradually over the next 6 to 9 months, but they didn't do very well. They were good games, so their ratings were pretty strong, and people played them, but the sales were fairly minimal. And by the summer of 2009, we were actually a little bit depressed because there was, in that same time period, Facebook and Facebook games had really taken off. Farmville launched in June of 2009, and people were making money, and there was so much energy in the space, and we really didn't have any traction at all. So what happened? Why am I still here? So what really saved us was the open nature of the Kongregate platform. In September of 2009, our first non-funded game integrated Creds. It was an indie MMO called Sacred Seasons, and immediately our sales, tripled overnight. And suddenly we had, a template of what to look at and what to look for, and a game to learn from. And we were able to then go out and target developers and encourage them to bring their games to their platform. We got our first Asian MMO in November, and our first Facebook game in January of 2010. And from that point on, we were sort of off to the races. So 4 years later, this is what the sales curve's like, and it's a really happy, good, strong, growing business. It's about 75% of our revenue, and that's with the advertising business growing. We really have a big mix of games, all in the core, mid-core region, from one-person developers all the way to big studios like Kabam and Kixeye, and big Asian developers as well. The great thing there is that we have a lot of data to work with and do cross comparisons and really sort of drill down and understand what's going on with games. And I'm going to use that to look at my terrible, terrible assumptions, or some of them are terrible. Transactions will be small. This is now totally hilarious to me. This is a chart of our purchases by package size in January of 2013. The median was 20, the average was 31, and I think it was 10% were for packages of $100 and more. If you look at revenue, almost half is coming from 100+ size purchases, and only 3% is coming from the $5 purchases. So yeah, lol. And therefore, the payment processing costs are not a big deal. It's only a problem on mobile. And I could go on a rant about the horribleness of carriers, but I'll save that for some other speech. But in sending larger purchases really, really is valuable. We've done testing on this and find that by increasing the amount of currency at the larger packages, we get a 14% lift in total revenue, and a 25% lift in people spending $25 or more. We're doing that at the platform level, but people should be doing it on every game as well. Whether you give people additional currency or exclusive items for buying a larger package, you should definitely do that. It's also very true that stored credit cards are powerful. So the LTV, the lifetime value on buyers who don't store their credit card, is $66, and they average 3.6 transactions, which is pretty good. But it is totally dwarfed by the LTV on the stored credit card buyers, which is 3 times as big. There's definitely some selection bias going on here. We default to storing people's credit cards. So the type of person who goes in and unchecks that box and says, I don't want it stored, is probably somebody who's sort of more of a careful, thoughtful spender to begin with. But the difference is so huge, you have to believe that the power of the stored credit card is huge. In general, the higher the friction of the payment type, the lower the value of the buyer. So credit card is definitely the best. PayPal is pretty close. We are able to store PayPal information, but the user has to opt in. Mobile, while it's convenient because it's right near you, most people are wanting to spend $20 or more, and to string together that in $5 and $10 increments is pretty annoying, and so the value there is not that high. Prepaid cards are better, probably because you can buy them in increments of $20 and larger, but of course the friction of going someplace and buying that prepaid card holds the value down. And offers, because most of the offers that our players take advantage of tend to be long surveys and things like that, where they spend an hour and earn 50 cents. That doesn't add up to very much either. Though at 5% of our incremental sales, we'll definitely take it. So almost all sales we find are for items that affect gameplay. About 70% is for permanent items, about 30% for consumables like energy, though this varies from game to game depending on the emphasis. Cosmetic items don't sell at all. Team Fortress 2 and WoW can make it happen because they have huge passionate user bases, but for most games it's not really viable. But the way an item looks does affect how well it sells. So when you're designing an item, your designer should be thinking of a spectrum from not so attractive to very attractive, so that there's more of an incentive to buy. Our players don't really gift, but content does sell somewhat, mostly in single-player games. It sells best when mixed with a package that includes skill points or another power-up or another mode or something that is useful at a lower level. The problem with selling content is that for most people, they're not interested in buying more content until they finish everything, and not everybody only a small percentage of people finish everything. So having a package where it's attractive to buy it earlier on increases your sales significantly. So yes, multiplayer is very important, but it's not exactly what we expected it to be. When we were funding games, we were thinking of synchronous multiplayer, because that feels like the most multiplayer-ish multiplayer. It's the person is right there, it's head-to-head, it's very competitive. But that was a mistake. So here's some data, and to give a little bit of background before I go into the data, all of the data from here on out, unless I call out otherwise, is lifetime data for games that have been on our platform at least 6 weeks and have some sort of minimum amount of traction for to be statistically significant. I've included a stat here called %50 plays, which is a good proxy for deep engagement. I usually talk a lot about engagement in my talks, but because I do that in other talks, I'm skipping it here. But %50 play, you're going to get like 90% of your sales from people who play your game 50 times or more. So it's a very important stat. So looking at this, you can see that asynchronous is does much better than synchronous multiplayer, particularly in engagement and then also in ARPPU. Single player, the sales are there, are much lower, but many very popular single player games have sales that really add up to be significant. So it's still worth doing. Another way to look at this data is the bubble chart. On the vertical axis, we've got ARPU, average revenue per user, and on the horizontal one we have ARPPU, average revenue per paying user. And you can see that these range from 0 to 250 in terms of the ARPPU, and 0 to $3 in terms of ARPU. Single player is all kind of down in the bottom left, and the multiplayer goes up from there. One thing that I think is interesting to point out here is that the best synchronous games do as well as the best asynchronous and both games, but the majority don't. There's a lot of hurdles in synchronous multiplayer. Some of it is technical in terms of lag times and matchmaking. Some of it is just the fact that it's less convenient to the player because they can't play, they can't play the people they want to play right at the time that they want to play it. And you also run into problems with critical mass. So there's a lot of challenges there, and I think that's what makes synchronous perform less well. When you can have both asynchronous and synchronous in a game, it's generally additive, but asynchronous should be the sort of starting point of multiplayer. What about PvP and PvE? The answer on that is that you should definitely do both if you can. PvP is the most important element. If you don't have that player-to-player competition, there's not the drive to invest in your character and to win. But if you can combine it with PvP and PvE, it's multiplicative, not additive. And I think there's several reasons for this. It increases engagement because it gives players more to do, and more to do is definitely very important in games. It's also great because it gives something for different player styles. And finally, I think PvE can be a sort of a nice stepping stone to a more competitive PvP situation for people who might otherwise be a little bit hesitant about getting their ass kicked. The other thing is that guilds make everything better. All of our top games have them. Guild wars and guild leaderboards are the most powerful form of PvP, much more so than just one person versus one person, because social dynamics kick in, and you care for yourself, but you also just care for your team. Multiplayer is very important, but it's not, oddly enough, it's not the most crucial element. It turns out that the single most important thing is a strong RPG system or strong character progression in some form. This breaking out multiplayer and single-player games by whether they have RPG elements, it's actually better to be a single-player single-player RPG than to be a multiplayer non-RPG. The engagement is much higher, and the investment is much higher. And if you have a single-player game without it, you kind of shouldn't. It's almost not worth putting virtual goods in. So multiplayer and what style of multiplayer often fits in with what the genre of the game is. Certain genres are more natural to certain types of combat than others. Not too surprisingly, if you've looked around, the subgenres that do the best are empire builders, CCGs, and loot fest style games. And when you can combine an empire builder and a loot fest, you have a really, really great game. Some of the weakest subgenres tend to be kind of in the shooter artillery range, and then also pet battlers. Now, I don't want people to think that games are doomed just because they're in these genres. I think they can be done right, but there's something, these are genres, particularly shooters, that tend towards synchronous multiplayer and, where guilds and clans are a little less natural, things like that. And then they also have problems in terms of the natural design for continued investment. If you buy a gun in a game and you like that gun, you probably don't want to buy another gun. So you've gotten sort of one, $10 purchase, when the games that do the best are ones that get, $7, $10 or $15 purchases. This is also broadly true. 65% of our revenue comes from English-speaking countries, but individual submarkets definitely outperform the U.S. This is our ARPU by country for the year 2012, and you can see that the United States is all the way down in number 15, with a bunch of Scandinavian countries, a bunch of Germanic countries, and some oil-rich states well above it. There is some selection bias going on here again. We're in English, our site is entirely in English, and somebody who's willing to register and play a game in not their native language is both likely more committed and more educated than the average person. But there's such a substantial gain there that it's clear that these are very, very valuable markets, and for that reason, we're going to be working on localizing Kongregate into more languages in the future. The other big lesson that we had from this is that it's really important to keep going. We struggled for nearly a year, 2 years if you include the development time, before we saw any success. Your first game isn't likely to do very well either, because free-to-play is hard and many important elements are counterintuitive. But once the elements come together, the improvement is really exponential, and so it's really worthwhile, and you can have a great business. So, don't give up, keep going. Thank you very much. If you are interested in hearing more stats and deeper dive into some really important topics like retention, big spenders, item pricing, we've got a bunch of other talks and slides up on our developer website. We'd also love to talk to any of you. We've got a booth here in the Silver sponsors, so please stop by. We're interested in talking about people coming onto our web games platform, and also we've just started a mobile publishing fund, and we'll be getting into that as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. Wow, and you thought you were going to go over.
I talked fast.
Questions for Emily about Kongregate? Games on Kongregate? Especially free-to-play games on Kongregate? Here you go.
Just had a question about technology, like using Unity or Flash. Are you seeing a lot of people going onto the site trying to play a Unity game and bailing out?
So we've got about 2,000 Unity games on our site, and some of the most popular games are Unity games. Counter-Strike Portable is doing really well on our site, and I think has over 10 million plays. So because when we launched Unity, we worked with Unity and really committed to it. We had a Unity contest, and we just sort of educated our players on it. Because of that, and because of the many good Unity games, we have an excellent plugin percentage. On returning users loading a Unity game, 96% already have the plugin, and 50% of new people going in have it. So we don't see that as a big barrier to popularity. We've only seen moderate success so far in terms of the Unity games for virtual goods, but I think that's just sort of a coincidence that they tend to be that we've tended to have a bunch of games that have been in shooters and other genres that are not so monetization friendly.
Other questions?
There's somebody over here.
Got a microphone coming.
Hi. You mentioned the big difference in lifetime value between users who stored their credit cards and users who didn't. Mm-hmm. Have you tried to do different things to incentivize people to let you store their credit cards?
We're discussing that. It's definitely something we're interested in. Since it's the default, I'm nervous about putting in an incentive on that first purchase, because I don't want to sort of lose that first purchase because people because we're being too aggressive on something, and people are afraid that we're going to just like keep draining their credit cards. So I'm a little hesitant about doing it there, but I definitely want to experiment with encouraging people to store their card on their second purchase and third purchase, since on average they're still going on 3.6 transactions is quite a lot. They are going on to purchase, so I think that's a good once they're more comfortable with the system, it's a good time to try and upsell, and we're going to be doing that.
Do you have a sense of, I saw the curve that was basically this sort of increasing curve of the number of free-to-play games that were being offered on Kongregate, and this increasing curve of the amount of revenue that was associated with those games. Mm-hmm. What percentage of the games do you think provide that revenue?
So there's definitely kind of a power function going on, where the very top games, we're getting, the majority of our revenue from our, top 10 games. We see that in the single-player games too, where gameplays tend to be, kind of low or, quite high. It goes up exponentially, and I think you see that in iOS and the App Store. It's just the nature when things come together, when players like the game, when the monetization is there, then we can really push it, and they combine together to really increase the revenue.
I had a question. First of all, thank you for your valuable lecture, Emily. And secondly, is there some kind of change in the audience of Kongregate? Is it still very male-oriented?
It is still very male-oriented, and particularly for virtual goods games, site-wide we see 85%, but I think it ends up being more like 90% in most of the successful multiplayer games. It's quite core. To give you a sense of the type of audience,